Well, I moved to Seattle in August of 1991, and Seattle had been bubbling and rumbling for a few years. People knew about this music scene that was happening, and I had come from Minnesota not that long before, maybe only a year before, and Minneapolis had a music scene, and there were these pockets of music scenes around the United States, Austin and Athens and Minneapolis. And Seattle was kind of another one. But no one knew that Seattle was going to become as international and big as it was going to become just months after I got there. And I got to Seattle the first time on the way to Alaska, and I remember sitting at this traffic light with some friends, and I looked up and the Space Needle was above me, and there was every mode of public transportation going. There was a monorail over my head, there was a bus going by, there was the Space Needle, there was all this stuff, and I just thought, I have to move here. This is the future. This is a future city, you know? And when I got back from Alaska, I stayed in Seattle, and my friend carried on. And I kind of, through the course of my time in Seattle, did all the things that people kind of did. I worked at Pike Place Market, which is the place where the guys throw the fish over the counter. I worked just down the way from those guys. I used to go to parties at their house, and we would eat seafood, piles and piles of seafood. And I used to walk down to Pioneer Square, which is the old area that used to be it was at the bottom of Skid Row, which was where they rolled the logs down. And Pioneer Square was kind of like a jazz hotbed in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and it still has the cobblestone streets, and it was the historical place, and there were jazz clubs and blues clubs down there. And I eventually, after leaving and coming back again to Seattle from Key West, Florida, eventually got a job as a bartender, but I first got a job just working the door and sweeping up and stuff at this club called the Off Ramp. And the Off Ramp was one of the clubs in Seattle at the time. And there were many. And the thing about Seattle is, at that time, there were all these bands that were coming up. There was Nirvana and Pearl Jam, the two that people remember the most. And you had Alice in Chains and Soundgarden and all these other peripheral bands that were so integral to the music scene, Mudhoney and Love Battery. And everywhere you went, there was, if it wasn't a bar or a club, it was just a place that was having music. And it wasn't just what people now call grunge, you know. It was every kind of music. There were instrumental bands doing jazz. There were these kind of like acoustic bands. There were funk bands. There was just music everywhere. And the thing that was so cool about Seattle, and why I think of it as kind of one of the last great music scenes as a city, is that no one segregated themselves from any kind of music. Everybody blended together and everybody mixed together. And these kind of celebrity bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam, those guys were just there. They would just show up. And there were so many times that I would have an interaction with Jeff Ament from Pearl Jam, whose girlfriend, ex-girlfriend, I dated and was dating at the time I met him, or Dave Grohl, who's now in the Foo Fighters, would show up and order a margarita, and I would give it to him for free because I revered him, and he would think, wow, why are you giving this to me? And he genuinely thought that. And it just felt like that all the time. And you've got this city where it's constantly gray and constantly dark and constantly not raining, but there's this mist. And no one uses umbrella because an umbrella is considered uncool. You just walk around kind of wet, and you've got your Doc Martens on, you know, and you've got your kind of, maybe you have shorts, but you've got something underneath the shorts, and you've got your leather jacket, or your this or your that, you know, and I mean, the people had beards to stay warm, and you had this mix of these rock stars together with Boeing that was coming up, the aeronautics, that was still coming up, and Microsoft was happening. But it was all kind of bubbling beneath the surface. It hadn't really happened yet internationally. But there was this strange buzz all the time. And maybe it was the fact that people drank so much coffee, because the coffee culture came from Seattle in the United States. So Starbucks was like on two corners. And you'd go to Starbucks because then it was just, oh yeah, you can get a latte. But you can get a latte anywhere. I was a barista in the beginning in Pike Place Market. And then when evening came, which came pretty fast because it was so dark, then you'd switch to beer. And you're in the club scene. So, and there, that was just beer and wine is what they serve at the clubs. You have to have food at a place to actually serve anything more than that. And the mix of all the different kinds of people and all the different rock stars always felt like there was just this community happening. Nobody ever thought that someone was bigger than anyone else. There were only a few times that I was completely starstruck. One of them was when I met a hero of mine. It was the final Dharma Bombs show, and I was bartending in the back bar in the showroom of the off-ramp. And the off-ramp was this very dark, very dingy club that had a really wide stage and really low ceilings. But it was one of the places to play. And it didn't seem that large ever. It always seemed small and dark. And in the corners, it's a rock club, so strange things were happening. And I was there at the back bar, and Michael Stipe walked up and ordered a Stoli on the rocks. And that's all he said to me. He said, I want a Stoli on the rocks. And I was so starstruck that I didn't even move. I couldn't even get him. He just waited for me to get the Stoli. And they were just there. Him and Peter Buck and the REM guys were there mixing a record, and they were all just, there was one day I was sitting at the graffiti bar, this juice bar, and Michael Stipe and Peter Buck were down the way. We were all having our very vegan meals, and they were looking at photographs for the new record. Metallica was a couple of chairs down, and they were talking about whatever, they were in town. And then there were various Seattle celebrity characters around. I think Jonathan Poneman from Sub Pop was there, and a girlfriend of mine was his assistant. But it never felt like it was elevated to a level that you were an outsider. You always felt like you were a part of things. And there was one time that I was down in Pioneer Square meeting my girlfriend at the time, and she was late, as she was most of the time. She was the door person at the Rock Candy. And there was a really beautiful woman sitting next to me. We were having a drink, and we were talking, and she said, oh, you really need to meet my boyfriend. He's late. And we kept talking, and he showed up. He was this very skinny little rooster-looking man, this tousled hair. And he shook my hand, and he had this nasally little voice. And I said, oh, it's really nice to meet you. And he said, oh, yeah, it's nice to meet you, too. I'm Layne. And I said, oh, I'm Gentry. And my girlfriend's coming. He knew my girlfriend, Danelle. And then they left. And Danelle walked up, and she said, oh, I didn't know you knew Layne. How do you know Layne? And I said, I don't know. I just met him. She said, well, that's Layne Staley. And I thought about it, and then I realized that I had just met the lead singer of Alice in Chains. And he was the most unassuming guy. And those things happen all the time. The only other time I was completely intimidated was any time the lead singer from Soundgarden would come into the club, Chris Cornell. He would come in, and he would sit at the back of the club in this round booth, sometimes by himself. I don't know why he sat by himself, but his eyes and his presence emanated so much energy, and I don't know if it was rock star celebrityness or if it was some other spiritual thing, but he emanated this kind of messiah thing. I don't know what it was, but no one would talk to him because he just, I know that he had, women would just fall over themselves, even just walking by him. And I never talked to him one time because I thought that maybe I would either be swept to hell, maybe, or I would be carried off to some rock and roll heaven. I don't know, but Chris Cornell, still to this day, I revere his whole energy. And Seattle was like that the entire time. And I still, to this day, think of it as one of my favorite times of my life, because it was this strange, bizarre renaissance of all these artists that knew something was happening, and they really just kept doing whatever they were doing.